Hello, YouTubers out there. This is Jerry Saravia at the movies. So I wanted to do one last video, even though I said I wouldn't, before the end of the year. And this one is just one I thought would be a good way to close it out um, because of what it is that I do in my spare time as a hobby, which is reviewing movies. Um, I've been writing film reviews now, I guess you could say professionally to a certain extent, since 1994. Or let's put it this way. Although I did get paid back then when I worked for a radio station, so I did a Jerry at the Movies show on radio, public access, when I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was getting paid to do this, so this was probably the first time ever that I got paid to do something. Um, but in those days, I think even then they don't have the same degree of depth that I've had in, say, the last 20, 25 years. But they did have some more depth than the stuff I'd written prior. Because the stuff that I wrote before usually was on paper, in a notepad, usually a clipped out newspaper ads of the movie, and with my comment and how many stars I gave it, and so on and so forth. And I still have a book full of all of these reviews. I might share that one of these days. From, I think, 1992 up until most of 94, and I did have one from the 80s, but I lost that book. Anyway, point is, I guess I started writing, let me chart this progress just right. I started writing on a bulletin board with clipped newspaper ads of the movies in 1982. So I had a bulletin board, and I thought every movie I see, I'll be able to put in this bulletin board with my comments on the actual ad itself, from a newspaper. And eventually that didn't quite fit, obviously. Wasn't a big enough newspaper or bulletin board for that. But then sometime after that, in junior high, I wrote for technically a magazine for junior high called the Ryan Voice. And I wrote in there, I think, my first real official review, which was I think I wrote it for The Razor's Edge with Bill Murray back then. Could have been Ghostbusters, but I think it was The Razor's Edge. And then in Jamaica High School, which I attended in Jamaica, Queens, New York, I wrote for the Hilltopper. That school, unfortunately, doesn't exist anymore. It's an administration building, which is a shame, because that school had been open for a good 80 years prior to when I attended, which is in 1985. So I wrote reviews for that paper, and I also became the first ever entertainment editor for that newspaper, that for a school newspaper. So it was kind of cool. But to actually get paid was through the radio show, and that was in 1994 or 93, maybe 94, somewhere around there. I think it was in 93. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I eventually, when I moved back east, I was in New York. So I wrote for the Village Times, which is in Setauket, New York, not far from Stony Brook University out there. And for that newspaper, I got paid, and I did that for about a good 2 years. So I guess you could call me a professional then. You're only a professional when you're getting paid. That's just how it is. And you're an amateur when you're not. But ever since then, I had thought, I wrote, then I started writing reviews and online in the internet since 1998. So ever since then, my reviews have gotten 10,000% better. Anyway, the reason I bring all this up is because I wanted to explain more or less the progress that I've made in doing this, and how I just love it as a hobby. I don't care that I don't get paid for it. For this channel, I'm not seeking a Patreon channel or to make it into a Patreon. I mean, I've thought about it, but on the other hand, I pay for all the movies I see, and there's streaming services and this and that and the other, so I don't always feel that people should feel obligated to give me money so that I can review these movies. But if they like the channel enough and it grows beyond where it's at now, I may consider that in the future, because then I could do this more often than I am, which I do very often anyway. But the reason I bring this up is it's a quick note about film critics versus movie reviewers. Now, here's the thing. There's really no difference between the two. In fact, one of my regular people that comment on here, Tim, who I've known for quite some time, although we've never met, hopefully someday I'll meet him, but the word he would use is semantics, because there's really no difference. But what's interesting is that with movies and music, you have music critics and music reviewers, I think, sometimes. Same thing with movie reviewers and film critics. You don't have that with art. So when there's a general sense about what art is, as Time magazine would have something on art, or the New York Times, or whatever the case may be, it's an art critic, not an art reviewer. So that's kind of interesting. It's not, it's thought of as a scholarly job. Film critic is considered in that same vernacular as a scholarly job. In other words, you have magazines like Film Comment and Cine East. These are written by film scholars. So these are people who you imagine would be wearing a bow tie and a tweed jacket, that type of look, you know. Whereas probably not many of them do that, but they probably teach film at a college or community college or whatever, so that gives them that's their backup in a way, and it justifies what they do. But film critics have also been, according to, I read it often, Quora. Somebody mentioned film critics are, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, who of course always wore vests and tweed jackets, or, sweater vests, suit and tie and all that stuff. Siskel and Ebert, people from the past like Janet Maslin, Pauline Kael, these are people who view it as a scholarly job, perhaps, but they have their credentials, so to speak, in journalism. But that's not a necessity anymore. It used to be. If you wanted to be a film critic, you wrote for a newspaper or a magazine or both. And if you were lucky, you became syndicated. So Peter Travers for Rolling Stone magazine, Owen Gleiberman at one time for Entertainment Weekly, now he writes for Variety. So that's kind of what they see. Now, movie reviewers, they've classified as just your average Joe, which I guess I would sort of fit in that vernacular. And but the truth is that, you see, when you're criticizing a film or reviewing it, there's really no difference. It may be different in terms of, as I mentioned before, Cine East or Film Comment. These are the type of magazines where they are much more in-depth and analytical. And they don't see it really as a job. They're just sharing, some of them anyway, their deep analysis of a film, or for that matter, BFI, Modern Classics, those type of books, of which I own some of them. A deep, full-bodied analysis of films like Taxi Driver or The Exorcist, or whatever. BFI has put out a lot of these type of books, written by notable film critics. Eyes Wide Shut was another one, and so on. But I think what they see as who they see as movie reviewers, according to Quora and some of these comments that I read, would be people who review movies on YouTube, just your average Joe. This movie sucks. The choreography was all over the place, or the cinematography, or the camera's roving everywhere, and I don't like these actors, and blah, blah, blah. Now, that kind of thing you can find a lot on YouTube. Or this is too woke, which has now become more commonplace in criticism, which Makes no sense to me. I don't understand that. I don't. First of all, I've mentioned before I dislike the word woke, but this is part of the new vocabulary when it comes to addressing movies that are progressive in their uh, diversity and this kind of thing. And but there's really no difference ultimately between movie reviewers and film critics. Um, it just depends on how one views it, really. But I often find that for me, one of the best film critics would be Danny Peary, who I've talked about on this show before, and I've interviewed him. He wrote cult movies 1, 2, and 3, and now he writes about baseball and so on. But and there's a cult movie stars book. I own at least a couple of these books of his, and he wrote with a passion. He was really looking at a film and seeing it as an experience and analyzing that experience. And to some degree, that would be Pauline Kael, who I almost never really agreed with on any movie she wrote about. But sometimes when she was really admiring something or thought it was a great film, you could really see that passion. But they didn't write in a scholarly fashion. It wasn't like anyone trying to kowtow to a certain snobbery, if you will, type of thing. And that to me is not really true of most of those film critics, from the past. Rex Reed never wrote that way. He was really an entertainment columnist, and he's not really a bad film critic. But he was really back in the 60s and 70s, up until the 80s when he took over At the Movies program after Siskel and Ebert left. Or I shouldn't say he took over. They had an At the Movies with Rex Reed and Bill Harris, and then eventually replaced by Dixie Watley. Dixie Watley replacing Bill Harris. But in the 60s and 70s, he was sort of like the rock star as a film critic. He was just very flamboyant, and he dressed, impeccably and this type of thing. Maybe he wasn't so flamboyant really, but he certainly dressed to the nines. Whereas all the other film critics they didn't really make a big stink about who they were. Some of them you don't even know what they look like. I still to this day, for some of you have known or read Stanley Kaufman, who passed away a few years ago. He wrote for the New Republic. I don't even know what he looks like, So, and Andrew Sarris, I think, who wrote for The Observer, which is where Rex Reed mostly writes now and has been for a while. But I don't even recall exactly what he looks like either. Richard Schickel, who passed away also. A lot of these people are gone. Anyway, the point is that they are not all scholarly. I look at films in a very specific way. For me, it's about pretty much the way Danny Peary does it, although I don't imitate him. And a combination more or less of Ebert and Siskel, more Ebert than Siskel. And the way Owen Gleiberman sees things, which is in terms of the experience of the movie, the totality of it, and what you can glean from it. So I try to write my reviews or construct my videos in such a way that anyone just watching would understand where I'm coming from. But I have the added bonus of some knowledge of film history and other films of a similar type of style or whatever, or to talk about the director. But at the end of the day, it's the totality of it, the experience. And the other thing I carry with me is also that anytime I see a new film, it's still very exciting to me. Just the very idea of it, something I've not seen before, or a new film, whatever the case may be. The excitement is, the opening credits, and you don't know where you're going to be. Some cases, of course, there are films that are mediocre and offer nothing. But it's the surprise element. I still look to be surprised. But what I'm also amazed by is just the very idea of it. Somebody made a film. This is an extraordinary thing. regardless of the input from other people or the output from the film. So I try to express it from that standpoint as well. So it's a few different levels, and that's just how I see things. Um, but I don't think there's a difference between the two, and I guess in some ways maybe I would be seen as a movie reviewer. That's fine. I'm not any more special than anybody else. I just try to look at things with some deep-seated knowledge and observe how a film gets to me. Sometimes, you can watch a film and not see how it's being done, but you're so involved in the story that then you go back and you look at it again, you notice things, certain camera angles, compositions, whatever the case may be. Sometimes it's very subtle, sometimes it's not subtle, sometimes it's really in your face. It depends on the type of story, depends on what you like about stories. Whether there's, then you look at it from other standpoint, which is there any heavy moralizing? Is it trying to speak to the audience or speak down to them? That type of thing. But those are all aspects that you can cover. Whereas what I find usually on YouTube, it's not true of everyone actually, is that many people that review films, they are not really reviewing them. They're reviewing what it is that they expected to see. And if certainly a franchise nowadays doesn't meet their expectations, then the film sucks almost automatically. And I don't even use the word sucks. For me, if a film doesn't work, I tell you why. If a film does work, I also tell you why. But it's not enough for me to just say, because I've often been asked in the past, somebody will come up to me and says, "Did you like that movie?" "Oh yeah." "Good." That's all they need to hear. They don't want to know what it is that I liked or loved or didn't like about it. But if you come across a person who has also seen it, and then they ask you about it and you've seen it, then you can have a conversation. And generally speaking, that conversation can be limited to just a few words, or you can be conversing about it a whole day. So that's kind of what I think Pauline Kael, one of her books is I Lost It at the Movies, was the title. And that there's truth in that. You can lose it, and sometimes that's a great way to have friendships. But Pauline Kael also, keep in mind, liked critics who agreed with her. You had to somehow see things the way she saw them as well, and agree with whether the film is worth seeing or not. And that's kind of silly. That's I don't agree with that. But anyway, so that's just how I do it, and I'm sure I pretty much simplified it maybe, but that's how I observe films and review them. So yeah, Happy New Year to everybody out there, and tell me what you think, if there's a difference really between film critics and movie reviewers, or name some of your favorite film critics or some of really bad film critics, or maybe I'm on that list of either or just average. I don't know. It's okay. Let me know what your thoughts. Happy New Year to everybody out there, and that's all I got to say. Please subscribe to my channel if you like what you hear. And this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.